Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious corners of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and in this episode we're going to discuss Ireland's most successful failure, Donegal's railway to nowhere. I'm from Donegal, and I love the county dearly, but I would be the first to admit that it's not the most fertile part of Ireland. Back in medieval times, Ireland was considered one of the richest lands of Europe for the fertility of its soil. This was why the Normans invaded, and why the Tudors placed all of Ireland under their dominion. The religious wars of the 17th century allowed the English crown to confiscate vast swathes of the country, which was then handed out to loyal English gentry. By the beginning of the 18th century, most of rural Ireland consisted of landed estates, often thousands of acres in size, owned by people who lived in England or Dublin and run purely as a profit-making venture. It's estimated that by the middle of the 19th century, over half the land in Ireland was owned by less than 1,000 people, and most of the rest by only 10,000. Donegal was no exception to this. Sir William Styles was the largest landowner there, owning 39,000 acres, a sizable chunk of the county. He was almost the stereotype of the Irish landlord. He went to Eton and Oxford, played cricket for Hampshire, and despite serving as High Sheriff of Donegal, Deputy Lieutenant of Donegal, and Justice of the Peace for Donegal, he set no roots in the county between his birth in Yorkshire and his death in Kent. It was where he went to work, to shoot pheasants with his friends, and to find out why he wasn't getting as much profit out of his estate as he expected. No more, no less. Styles was not just the biggest landowner in Donegal, but also the one who probably turned the most profit. His estates were to the south of Raphoe, in good farming country. Others were not so lucky. Blackjack Adair, who we've spoken about before, owned over 16,000 acres in the centre of Donegal, bought with the money he made speculating on land in America. Shortly after buying the land, he evicted all of his tenants and turned it into a hunting preserve. Nowadays, it's the second largest national park in Ireland. The reason Blackjack was able to get the land so cheaply was because it was not suitable for the profit-making ventures the English landlords wanted. You couldn't put cows on it, you couldn't put sheep on it, you couldn't grow wheat. None of those cash crops were available. This was also true of the coastal areas to the north and west of his estates, an area that became known as one of the most notorious congested districts in Ireland. The word congested, used in this context, is often confusing to people. It comes from the Latin congestus, meaning to accumulate or to pile up. In the 16th century, medical men began using it to describe blockages in bodily fluids, most commonly nasal congestion, also known as a blocked nose. It also came to describe traffic being blocked due to overcrowding. So it's ironic that its third, less common definition actually means the opposite in this case. If a farm is congested, that means it is not capable of supporting the farmer financially. So in Ireland, a congested district was one that wasn't profitable for the landlords. The usual reason was low population density, but part of that was because they were not places that could support large populations. It was in this sense of the word that the British government set up the Congested Districts Board in 1891. This was a strange period in the history of Ireland's relationship with Britain. The last general election in 1886 had been triggered by the failure of the Liberal government to pass a law allowing home rule in Ireland. In the aftermath, the party had split, and the new Liberal Unionist Party had won 77 seats in the general election. They allied with the Conservative Party as the only other Unionist party. This created a situation where the government were against home rule, but did not want to be too hardline about it. From this was born a new type of thinking, constructive unionism, or killing home rule with kindness. This revolutionary thinking was that if they actually invested in improvements in Ireland, then the people might not actually want to leave the Union. This would eventually lead to things like land reform, allowing tenants to buy their farms if their landlord went bankrupt, for example. Another part of this was the dairy processing cooperative companies that still operate in Ireland today. And a third was the Congested Districts Board, set up to improve Ireland's most poverty-stricken areas. One of the main ways it did this was through promoting local crafts and skills to turn them into cottage industries. The Aran sweater, one of the symbols of Irishness round the world, became popular through one of their schemes. So did the massive fishing industry on the west coast, over £100,000 was spent on updating the infrastructure of Irish fishing ports. Nearly 100 boats were provided to fishermen around the country, with a quarter of those being built in Ireland as well. But just as often, the board threw money at obviously doomed projects that never worked out. Conflicts of interest were also a problem. Many people asked why Letterkenny Cathedral received a large grant from the CDB for its construction in the 1890s, and others pointed to the presence of the Bishop of Raphoe on the board as explanation enough. The board was in general a force for improvement in Ireland, though probably not as effective as it could be, and some of its projects are harder to quantify in terms of success or failure. One of those was the Burtonport extension to the Derry to Letterkenny railway line. Incidentally, the debate between calling the largest city in the northwest of Ireland Derry or Londonderry is a long and tortuous one. I have no intention of getting into it here, but since Londonderry is part of the railway's official name, I will call the city Derry for balance. The full official name of the railway line between it and Letterkenny, the largest town in Donegal, was the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway, though it was usually just known as the Swilly, so that's what I'll call it. As the name suggests, it was initially founded in 1853 to connect to the shore of Lough Swilly. A little geography is needed to set the context. The city of Derry sits on the two shores of the River Foyle in the northwest of Ireland, which feeds out into Lough Foyle. This large estuary lake cuts into the country from the north coast and forms one side of the Inishowen Peninsula. Nowadays, it's the Republic of Ireland on one side of the lake and Northern Ireland on the other. The other side of the Inishowen Peninsula is formed by Lough Swilly, a glacial ford that cuts from the northern coast 25 miles south to Letterkenny. In the 1830s, a canal between Lough Foyle and Lough Swilly began construction to save ships having to go round the peninsula. It failed, but the work that had begun in it was reused by the Swilly Railway for their first line. This took 10 years to complete, opening in 1863 and connecting to Farland Point, where a ferry departed for Rathmullen. The railway station for the line in Derry was built on the west bank of the Foyle, with a larger station on the other bank for the lines to Belfast, Coleraine and Strabane. One of the most distinct features of Derry is the Craigavon Bridge, a blue double-decker road bridge. Nowadays both levels are used for traffic, but at this time the lower level was used for railway freight. Wagons would be connected to cables at one end and winched over to the other side using horses. This was a much more economical alternative to building a railway bridge that could support the weight of a train. The Farland Point line was not really that profitable. It closed down in 1866. By that time, the railway had built a line to Buncrana, which proved much more popular. In 1883, they reopened a part of the Farland Point line to connect to a new line that had been built along the shores of Lough Swilly to Letterkenny. For the first time, the two largest towns of the northwest were connected by train. The new railway, known as the Letterkenny Railway, was an independent entity, but they didn't have any trains of their own, and the line was worked by Londonderry and Lough Swilly trains. Their station sat next to that of the Finn Valley Railway, which connected Letterkenny to Strabane in one direction and southwest into Donegal in the other. At that time the line went to Stranorlar, but eventually it would reach all the way across the county to Buncrana and Killybegs. By that time, the Finn Valley Railway had become a part of the Donegal Railway Company. This line became a critical lifeline for the Donegal fishing industry, in those days before refrigeration. Fish could leave the docks at Killybegs, be loaded onto a train to Belfast, and then be taken by ship to London to go on sale in the markets before they had time to spoil. It transformed Killybegs into what is still the largest fishing port on the island of Ireland. Given the way the Congested Districts Board had supported the fishermen, this was a major success for them, and it started them thinking that perhaps the railways could have the same effect in other parts of the country. This led to the Railways of Ireland Act of 1896. It provided for the government to fund half the cost of the construction of a railway, or the full cost if the railway was within a congested district. 2 applications were made for the railways in Donegal to be funded under the Act. One was to Carndonagh on the Inishowen Peninsula. This was built as a continuation of the existing railway to Buncrana. The other was the Burtonport extension. Burtonport is a small fishing village in the northwest corner of Donegal. It was founded in the 1780s by the Irish MP William Burton Cunningham. He was born as William Burton, but took the Cunningham surname as a condition for inheriting the title of Baron and his uncle Henry's estates. He is best known for beginning the construction of Slane Castle, one of Ireland's most famous stately homes and the site of an annual music festival. Burtonport had its own share of history, and we may return to it in later episodes. For the purposes of the extension, though, it had two main qualifications. First was that the Baron had ambitions of turning it into a fishing port to rival Killybegs. The second was that any railway line to it would have to go along the north coast of Donegal. This would connect many areas that were a perpetual headache for the CDB to the rest of the country. The new railway was to be owned and funded by the Department of Public Works and operated by the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway Corporation. It was built by the two as a cooperative exercise. The idea was that the Swilly would plan the route and supervise the construction, but the department would have final say over any decisions. Naturally, this would lead to some friction. Once the railway was running, the department would provide the engines to work it and the funding for maintenance, both of which would be carried out by the Swilly. One of the goals of the department was to get a working line for the absolute minimum amount of investment, and this led to some ridiculous corner cutting. In 1898, the general manager of the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway, John McFarland, made a complaint to his board about it. Some of his complaints were serious. They had shortened sidings, hadn't built good sheds at every station, and were refusing to pay for staff training. Others were more ridiculous. The department made the princely saving of £4 whole by not buying any door knockers for any of the station houses. Their penny pinching also impacted on the design of the line. Stations were built and lines were laid wherever the land was cheapest, leading many of them to be miles away from the nearest town. The foundations of the lines were of low quality, which would lead to maintenance headaches later, and they refused to listen to the Swilly's advice on the locomotives. They bought 4 locomotives from Andrew Barclay, Sons and Company, which the Swilly engineers thought were not powerful enough for the line. The engines did manage to work it, but their low power might have been a factor in a disaster several years later. At the time, though, it has to be admitted that if the aim of the Board of Public Works was to spend the least amount of money on the construction of the line, they were successful. It's hard to see how they could have spent less and still had a working line. And in fact, working is being generous. When the line was opened for business in March of 1903, the hidden cost of their penny pinching became apparent. Within 3 months, questions were being asked in Parliament about their practices due to reports of passengers being transported in open trucks rather than carriages. And in August of 1903, a small landslide blocked part of the track. Only the alertness and quick reactions of the driver prevented a disaster. In addition, the engines continued to be inadequate for the lines, and the lack of any repair facilities outside of the Derry station meant that their condition kept deteriorating. In August of 1904 alone, 6 different engine failures delayed the trains. The condition of the line was also far from the best. Public complaints led to an official inquiry in 1905, carried out by an experienced railway manager named Joseph Tatlow. His report was further evidence of the rift between the board and the Swilly, since it made no mention of any issues caused by the board's lack of funding. He blamed it all on the incompetence of the Swilly's engineers and the inadequacy of their construction. Finally, in 1908, it reached the point where it went in front of the Viceregal Commission on Irish Railways. They found plenty of fault to go around, both in funding and in execution. The eventual outcome was that the board would pay the money they owed the Swilly and fund the additional improvements that were needed. To help this, the land around the lines that hadn't been used yet would be sold off. This resolved the immediate issues, though tensions between the two and disagreements would continue for years to come. World War I impacted everyone and everything in Ireland, and that included the Swilly Railway. Lough Swilly became a naval base for the British fleet, since it was a naturally protected harbour. This put fishing from Buncrana on hold, which took a lot of the freight off the line. Tourism also declined, and this all meant the railway had even less money to spend on maintenance. This all came to a head in 1917. The board called on their old ally Joseph Tatlow to make a survey of the condition of the line, and his report was damning. He highlighted issues like train delays, malfunctioning lighting in the carriages, the poor state of the toilet facilities at the stations, and more. All of this combined to show a line that was barely functional, suffering from long-term neglect and a lack of long-term thinking. The end result was that the chairman of the Swilly resigned, and the line was taken out of their hands and put under the control of a special manager to try to bring it up to date. With the war interfering, this took a bit longer than expected, but it did help to revitalise the line after the war. Or rather, after one war ended and another kicked into gear. Exactly when the Irish War of Independence started is a matter of debate, but the Easter Rising in 1916 was what set a spark to the tinder. The Swilly Railway was attacked several times by Irish nationalists, though usually non-violently. Armed men boarded it to rescue prisoners being transported or to steal military cargo. Pressure was put on the staff to refuse to work on trains with soldiers on board. And on multiple occasions, rocks were placed on the track to derail the train whenever people thought it was being used for military purposes. In fact, at the moment the truce was declared and Irish independence became a reality, the line was out of action because a section had been pulled up and thrown into a river. Things didn't really improve once it was running again, as the Independence War turned into a civil war, and a cross-border train became a highly visible symbol of the border's existence. By the time things finally calmed down in 1923, the train had to deal with customs inspections and additional bureaucracy, another burden for the troubled corporation to deal with. The new Irish government nationalised their railways in 1924. It was the only way to handle the fragmented, formerly British companies who had faced massive losses over the last few years of disruption. In order to prevent headaches, this excluded railways that passed through the north of Ireland, meaning that both of the Donegal railway corporations were left to fend for themselves. Two governments on either side of the border told them they were powerless to offer them any state support, and said that the matter would need to be decided by the Council of Ireland. This was a body established by the 1920 treaty that would include members of both the UK Parliament and the Irish Dáil, and would rule on cross-border matters. The only problem is that the Council of Ireland never held a single meeting between being created in 1920 and being abolished in 1925. That was also the year of the worst accident in the history of the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway, the Owen Carrow Viaduct disaster. The Swilly's adverts for excursions to Donegal highlight the county's bracing air, which is putting it mildly. The west coast of Ireland is notorious for its high winds, and Donegal is no exception. In January 1884, less than 7 months after the Swilly Railway opened, 2 simultaneous accidents happened on Donegal railways during the height of a storm. First, just outside Stranorlar station, 2 carriages of a Donegal railway train were blown off the tracks. Less than 15 minutes later, as the Derry train crossed a bridge over the Swilly River near Pluck, all of the carriages were blown clear off the track and down the bank. Only the engine was left on the track. Fortunately, none of the passengers were seriously injured. Normally, the company would have used a crane to lift the carriages back onto the track, but none was available. So temporary tracks were laid in the road to Letterkenny, and they were pulled there by horses. It was a wake-up call to respect the Donegal weather, and no more derailments happened until 1908. This was on the new line from Letterkenny to Burton Port. One of the most impressive parts of the Burton Port extension was the Owen Carrow Viaduct. This was a great arched bridge with the railway line on top that stood 115 feet tall and stretched for 440 feet along one of the most cragged parts of Donegal. You can still see a portion of it standing just outside Creeshlock, and parts of the rest of it are scattered across the fields. Just like the Swilly Railway, it's left its mark on the county. As the train passed over the viaduct, passengers could see all the way to Glenveigh Castle in the distance. In 1908, as the winds roared down the valley, they lifted 2 of the carriages off the rails. Only the railing on the bridge prevented them from tumbling down into the valley below. It was a warning, and one the Swilly Railway did not heed. For years afterwards, passengers pointed to the bent railings, not knowing what awaited. The 1920s was near the end of the Lough Swilly Railway, which was a problem on 2 accounts. First was that the carriages were less full and so lighter. Second was that the consequences of this went unheeded. In 1922, near Dunfanaghy Station, 1 carriage was blown off the tracks and down the embankment. Only 1 person was in the carriage, a boy, who survived. In 1923, 2 carriages were lifted off the line. Again, there were no casualties, but there were some very shaken passengers. And finally, on the night of the 30th of January 1925, the inevitable happened. Gale force winds with gusts of up to 120 miles per hour were blowing through the Owen Carrow Valley as the train crossed the viaduct. One particular vicious gust derailed the back carriage and it smashed through the railing. It dragged the other carriages behind it, including the passenger car, which held 14 people. As it was dragged across the parapet, the roof was torn from the carriage and they fell into the valley below. Worse, the two goods vans smashed into the wall at the edge of the viaduct and sent chunks of it cascading down towards the passengers. 4 of them were killed, including a married couple, Philip and Sarah Boyle. Their young son was injured but survived. At least 6 of the passengers were named McFadden, though I don't know if they were related. 4 of the McFaddens are listed among the injured, 1 severely, while the other 2 were recognised at the inquest for their bravery in rescuing 2 female passengers who were dangling over the edge. Only 1 passenger was completely unhurt, a woman named Campbell, who was flung clear of the wreckage and landed on her feet in a soft patch of bog, sinking up to her knees in it. The jury at the inquest found that the cause of the derailment being so bad was the decision to separate the railing into several sections, and there was nothing the crew of the train could have done. The Owen Carrow disaster came near the end of the Swilly Railway's life, but while it might have put some passengers off, it was not really a factor in that end. 2 inescapable things caused the end of the railway: partition and roads. With customs at the border, using the railway to transport goods was less palatable. But the rise of goods transport by road was the real issue. The low volume of goods going by train were much better suited to being transported by truck, and people soon realised this. That included the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway Company themselves, who swiftly diversified into a trucking and private bus service. By the 1930s, their road operations had brought the company back into profitability, while the railway was a net loss for them. In 1935, as they managed to get out of contracts, they began closing railway lines. The Burton Port Extension, the railway to nowhere as it was often dubbed, closed partially in 1940 and permanently in 1947, the Swilly Railway being entirely closed by 1953. The company continued on through the 1970s, but fell in hard times and was sold off after declaring bankruptcy in 1981. Continued as a bus company for decades longer, becoming a central part of the school bus service in Donegal. In fact, it was so central that the firm was blocked from closing some of its routes in 2003. It was eventually forced into bankruptcy in 2014. The story of the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway is often told as one of failure. But is that entirely fair? The objective of the Congested Districts Board was to keep the north of Donegal alive. The local fishing and cottage lace industries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries owe their survival to the railway, and both have their successors still operating to this day. The tourist industry in that area was also established by the excursion trains from Derry. As for the Swilly Corporation themselves, well, despite being less than profitable at times, it lasted as a railway with 100 miles of track for a full century, and as a bus company for 60 more. It employed hundreds of people and was a part of the landscape of Donegal for generations. It might be gone now, but it was more a victim of the passage of time and the evolving landscape of transport, rather than any grand failure. The ruins of the railway still mark the Donegal landscape, firing the imagination of children with thoughts of times gone by. It had a legacy, and in the long run, that's the best anyone can hope for. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. And if you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.